My name's Millie Chowles and I'll be your host for the next hour. I'm a radio producer, presenter and podcaster, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Julia Samuel. Julia is a paediatric counsellor and one of the UK's leading psychotherapists. She was awarded an MBE in 2015 for her services to bereaved children, is founder patron of Child Bereavement UK, and is a vice president of the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. She's also authored 2 best-selling books, brilliant books, Grief Works and This Too Shall Pass. Welcome, Julia.
Hello, Millie. Lovely to see you.
Yeah, lovely to see
and
you.
And everybody who's watching. It's so lovely that you're all online, and I kind of wish I could see your faces too. That would be such a lovely thing.
So the purpose of our chat today is that we're going to be trying to get a better understanding of grief, and also very much about how best to support other people, ourselves and other people, our loved ones, going through the grieving process. Obviously you've written a lot about this in your books, which I've read both of, and they're brilliant, which was with a small baby, but I have to say they're absolutely brilliant. I've learnt so much from them. And though very sad and moving, of course, there was so much hope, so much optimism and humanity. They're very beautiful. In the books, you choose to use case studies of real life therapeutic relationships that you've had, and then they're interspersed with your own reflections. Why did you choose to use that format and focus on these real people's stories?
I think because of many reasons. One, because I think the most personal is the most universal. That when I showed through the relationship I had with my clients what their real feelings were, what they said, what they felt, people can really identify with them, even if they have a completely different background or a different loss. And also, I think we relate most through stories. We love kind of having people's stories. I think we're meaning-making beings through stories. And also because I had so many stories built up in me from my 30 years as a therapist, it was like they were kind of pushing up into my head to come out. And I didn't even really realize how much I remembered. But when I started writing, they just came kind of pouring out of me. So it was an expression I think I needed to do of kind of recognizing how I'd been changed by the relationships I'd had with people, what I'd learned. And also to use that, I hope, in a way that really meant something to the people reading it, so they could really feel the two of us in the room. They could really recognize the person who I was describing, that they wouldn't feel so alone. So much of grieving, whether it's a living loss like your job or your relationship, or at the moment all the kind of normal structures of our lives, or a loss from death, is very isolating and distancing. So I wanted something that people can kind of hold on to and go back to, that they could see themselves and feel comforted by that, and to give them hope.
Yeah. And I think when you are immediately introduced to a lot of the case studies, you might think, oh, these people are very different from me, they have got very different lives, but then the feelings and the thoughts that they have, kind of those differences disappear, and you're connected by that shared humanity, I guess, that we all have. You start Grief Works actually by defining grief, and I thought that would be a good place for us to start today. What is grief?
I think grief, the Latin meaning of grief is being robbed. So we've been robbed of the present and the future that we expected through the death of the person that we love, that's significant to us. The measure of our grief is the emotional investment in the person that's died. So the more that we've loved them, the more significant they are, the greater the loss. I think grief itself is the meaning we make of that relationship and of that loss. And mourning is the expression of grief. And they're interconnected, because by kind of recognizing what that person means to us, and then finding a way of expressing that, however it is, and there are thousands of different ways of expressing our grief, that is how we eventually learn to adapt. And grief for most people is an adaptive normal process, but it's the pain of it that forces us to shift and face the reality, this reality that we didn't want or choose, that the person we love has died. And the things that we do to block and avoid the grief are often the things that do us harm over time. And in families, that can be passed down through many generations.
And I also wanted to ask you why you were drawn to this subject and how you started working in bereavement yourself.
I mean, there's a sort of outside story that I worked for a charity, Birthright, which was about infertility and supporting women who couldn't have babies. And that introduced me to a whole world of baby loss and baby death that I hadn't really been aware of. I kind of thought that happened in the Victorian times and didn't happen anymore. But then, you know, once I started training, of course, as a therapist, you have to understand yourself and your own foundations of what makes you up as a human being. And both my parents, my mother and my father, had had significant losses by the time they were 25. So my mother, her entire family was dead, her mother, her father and her sister and her brother by the time she was 25. And my father, his father and his brother. And they never spoke about them. I didn't know any stories about them. There were these black and white photographs of people around the house who I kind of knew that there was some kind of relation, but I didn't know they were my grandparents or my aunts and uncles. And the way my parents were was that I could never make out what was really going on. So they talked about things that didn't matter and never talked about things that really mattered. And I think being the youngest of 5 children, I kept my way of trying to kind of make sense of it was by observing what was going on and becoming much more interested in what people were feeling on the inside rather than what they were showing on the outside. And when, as you say, when you talk about the stories, I think one of the things that's significant in the stories is that our differences, our cultural differences, our racial differences, our religious differences, when you're aware of the person on the inside, they don't disappear because they're very much part of them, but you see them in a completely different context.
I can actually relate to that a lot. I also didn't know any of my grandparents, and it's not until I've become an adult that I actually started to question that. And that actually leads on. There's a phrase that you use in your book, and that I've heard. Obviously, I've been sort of reading a lot around the subject of grief. This idea of repressed grief, and I was wondering what that actually means and what are the common manifestations of unresolved grief.
And repressed grief is part of unresolved grief. I mean, there are many sources of unresolved grief, and it can be traumatic grief, it can be many different things. I think when we talk about the normal, if there is a normal, the natural kind of adaptive process of grief is that we allow the pain to change us. So we adapt to this new reality. And that means that we allow ourselves to feel the pain, which gives us the emotional bandwidth to feel joy. So our capacity to engage in life stays wide because we move between the states. I think unresolved grief, we find even looking at the pain or allowing us to recognize the suffering, we block it, and we block it with our behaviors. By being busy is a very common nowadays, particularly anesthetic, alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, any way that we can to block the pain means that we also block our capacity to feel at all. So our capacity to feel is foreshortened. So we function fine, but we are very kind of disconnected. And all of us know people like that, where you kind of feel that if you tap them, they're kind of made of tin. But also what we know from research is that when loss comes again, which it always will, a new loss always ignites a previous loss, whether you've done the work or not. And if you haven't done the work, then your capacity to deal with it gets less and less. And so people who have unresolved grief have at one end many symptoms of depression, anxiety, but at the other end have less satisfaction, less joy, and actually even less success in life.
As
a long answer, sorry.
No, it's a fascinating answer, and it really makes a lot of sense. Actually, I was just thinking, as you know, I recently become a mum, and you're talking about this kind of capacity for joy and also for sadness and the full range of emotions. I feel like it's kind of cracked me open, and because I'm feeling this joy, I'm also close to tears most of the time. I just like feel everything in sort of 3D HD at the moment. And I guess, if you shut down one, you shut down all of it and you start to suppress all of it. There's a wonderful quote from you that I heard actually on Desert Island Discs, and it's that grief counselling is not about forgetting and moving on. It's about remembering and rebuilding a trust in life. So I was wondering kind of what you mean by this and how you help people to do this.
So part of the way of grieving, or part of the task of mourning, is to allow yourself to face the reality that the person is no longer present in your life. But, my parents' generation, who were the Second World War generation, very much were forget and move on. Don't talk about them, go forward and stiff upper lip. And what we understand now, that as human beings, actually much more like the Victorians and centuries earlier, is that although the person has died, the relationship very much continues. So people talk about continuing bonds. And so the love with that person never dies. And what I do with clients and family members and myself is finding and creating touchstones to memory to the person that died. So it may be going on a walk with a family friend that you always did with that person. It may be wearing something of theirs. It may be making their lasagna. It may be making their drink. It may be reading a poem. But it's things that, because your relationship with them is embodied. It's very much part of you. One of the things that I think is a lovely way of thinking it is that heaven is the place where you have a memory of the person that died. And so that when I'm with clients, once they've kind of done a lot of the work and they're not in that most kind of shuddering, raw state, people can have the person in front of mind where they choose to step into it and remember them, and may write them a letter or a postcard or in some way connect with them, play a piece of music, and they can have them back of mind so that they can engage with life, trust in life, dare to love again, live again. And that it's a constant moving process of oscillation, of being in connection and a little bit less in connection. But if you ever kind of want to ask that person, should I, if your parent has died, should I marry this man, or should I take this job, or should I go on a journey? You know them so well, they become part of you, and they'll always be able to answer your question.
One of the most commonly kind of repeated things around grief is that there's different phases, and you're sort of talking about these moving between these different phases.
Kubler-Ross.
Yes, exactly. The anger, bargaining, denial, and so on. How helpful do you think that it is to think about grief like that, and in these different distinct phases?
I mean, I think Kubler-Ross was groundbreaking at the time. Of course, her phases and stages were much more to do with facing your death than someone grieving. And I think what's very helpful about them is that we do have those feelings, that we can feel numb, we can be bargaining, we can be angry, we can feel very low. And so I think it's very useful to identify the normal emotions of grief, because when you're grieving, you feel kind of crazy. You feel furious one minute, desperate the next minute. And so kind of recognizing that kind of cocktail of different emotions is very much part of grief, I think is very helpful. What's less helpful is, I think in 21st century, we want this sort of fast track app for grief, and you want the 10 things that you can do to get through grief. And I think sometimes the stages and phases are like this sort of marching orders, that you go from one to the other and then you come out the other end and then you're sorted. And And for anyone who's grieving, they know that isn't the case, that this is an adaptation, accommodation process, that you oscillate between feeling the pain of it and being okay with it, and you move between the two. But grief isn't something that you get over. It's something that you kind of learn to live with, and it becomes part of you, and it changes you in some ways also for the good. It's by no means all bad.
And yeah, so yes, it does. It changes you profoundly. And again, we want that easy answer. Often we want to soften the blow and look for the silver lining. And obviously we have the saying, you know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. How true do you think that is? Or how helpful do you think that is?
I mean, there's always a nugget of truth in cliches, aren't there? I think what's really annoying about cliches for the people who are bereaved is that they feel diminishing, that they feel like their very personal, very intense, painful process is being kind of ticked into a box and being in some way diminished by the cliche. You know, they've gone to a better place, you know, the one you've just quoted. And I think what is true is that people are changed by it, and they can discover in themselves. It never takes away the level of the loss that they feel or how difficult it is. But when people have kind of come through surges, and it often feels like a wave of pain and loss, and discover that the sky hasn't fallen in, that they still survive, and then they find that they're laughing, or they find that they have energy for life, they find that they have maybe more resilience and more strength than they ever imagined that they would. Their perception of what matters in life, their gratitude for those that are alive, for their own life, feels changed and kind of shinier and brighter. So people do, you know, there's this idea of post-traumatic growth, which is certainly true. But you don't feel it all the time. That's the thing.
Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit about good ways, you know, helpful ways to support people and less helpful ways. And you talk a lot about that in your book. I guess saying cliches to people is one of the less helpful ways. But what are the other common sort of mistakes? I don't want to call it mistakes because I know they're often very well intentioned, but what are the common kind of things people do that aren't quite as helpful as they might like to think?
I mean, I think the first step is to not step away. So that, you know, we have this kind of magical thinking about death that somehow if you get close to it, if I think about it, if I'm close to someone who's grieving, it's somehow going to hasten my own death, or it puts you in touch with your own mortality, or that death is catching. So our ignorance makes us scared, but we have a very well-intentioned, we want to be able to say something that feels helpful, or that we're going to fix the other person. So I think the first thing is to kind of put that down and recognize that the best thing you can do for the person is to move towards them with some humility, that you don't know what they need or what they want, and the capacity of your humanity to connect and be with that person. And probably the best thing you can do is listen. That there are no fixes. I mean, I was saying to you earlier from the talks I did, the problems feel so big and so deep that I feel very inadequate with the things that I say, that I want to come up with some kind of miraculous answer that kind of makes it all sorted. And of course that isn't the case. None of us can do that. But the single biggest predictor of outcomes for those that are grieving is the love and connection to others. That when love dies, it's the love of others moving towards us and connecting and supporting us that allows us to survive and feel alive. And you know which kind of friend you are. If you're a very good friend and a very close friend, you need to show up, and you need to do more than just text and say, you know, I'm thinking of you, let me know if I can help. You need to actually offer help, or say, what can I, you know, tell me what I can do to help. I actually want to help. Do you want me to take your kids to the playground? Do you want me to bring food? Do you want me to sit and to give you soup and listen to you? Do you want to watch a movie with me? Any of the things that make yourself available. And if you're a really good friend, it needs to be for the long haul. You know, I think as a society, we have a prescription of how long you're allowed to grieve. You know, if it's your grandparent, I think we give you kind of 2 or 3 months. If it's your parent, we might give you much longer. But actually, grief always takes longer than anybody wants or what society allows. So, yeah.
Yeah. And that reminds me of something that I read from you as well, that society sort of approves if we look like we're functioning and getting on in the world, and disapproves if we retreat from the world. But actually, that's not a very accurate way of looking at it. Actually, we do need to retreat, and we do need to feel this stuff and not just pretend it hasn't happened. And you're talking about being with people, and I know that obviously at this time that's such a kind of loaded thing, and you know there's so much happening in the world, so much kind of collective loss, collective grief, but also the kind of grief of separation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I had my first baby in lockdown, and I know that you've had a grandchild in lockdown, and for the first months of their lives, you know, couldn't see any family. Couldn't see any family. And, you know, how do we cope with that in these times where we can't actually physically be together a lot of the time?
If I just step back, the thing of being with somebody else, one of the things I think that we find difficult is that when people are distressed, this idea that we think they're doing well when they don't show it, because when people are distressed, it's embodied and they send off signals of distress that we pick up bodily, and that sends our body into fight or flight or freeze, and we feel like somehow we need to be able to do something, and often we fly because we find it too disturbing being with them. And I think being a friend, you need to kind of just breathe and recognize that that is transmitted to you, and you need to find a way of managing your emotions to kind of try and level that out. I think the pandemic has added the social distancing, I think, are the chilliest, you know, damaging words in our lexicon right now. And we need each other more than ever. We need community, we need family, we need friendships, we need love to help us kind of feel calm and have hugs and touch and connection. And for millions of us, that isn't, it's against the law, and it isn't healthy. It's a life threat. So it is an added level of distress, which I think will have very major implications for people who are grieving, but also for people who have pre-existing difficulties and for people in general. So I think what the research so far shows is that people who already had a mental health disorder are feeling it much worse than they did before. People who were grieving before are feeling worse than they did before. People who are grieving probably weren't at the bedside or the graveside of the person that died, so they're more likely to have complex grief. They don't have family around to support them. They haven't had the normal rituals, so they're going to be suffering. Young people are really suffering. So it was 25% of young people who had some kind of anxiety disorder. That's gone up to 35%, the research has shown for now, particularly girls. So, you know, the WHO said the next pandemic will be a mental health pandemic, and I think we're kind of almost in it, probably. And I wish I had answered. I mean, I do think Zoom and connection and FaceTime and phones is better than no connection. It's better than nothing. So I think we have to kind of make a real effort and use what we do have. I think when you can, if you can have socially distanced walks with people or go outside with people, being physically in the presence of someone, even if it's 2 meters apart, I think makes a big difference. But, you know, I think it is storing up huge problems for everybody. And it's incredibly complicated that what is saving our lives from a health perspective is also really damaging us.
I've certainly sent more photos and videos and letters as well than I probably ever have in my entire life. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And lovely
something tangible, because everything's so invisible. I think tangible things like postcards, letters, sending food. I don't know. I think those things feel very concrete, and you can kind of almost smell the person's perfume on the card and things. I think that really helps.
Yeah. So you talk obviously in This Too Shall Pass about living losses, and we've touched on that. Obviously, we've just been speaking about it. But what do you mean by living losses, and what kind of things are they? I guess for me, like the first thing that came to mind was the end of a relationship. Is that right? Is that what you would class as a living loss?
Yes, so I think a living loss is any significant loss in your life that isn't necessarily death. So it could be the loss of a job, it could be moving country, it could be the breakup of a relationship, whether it's a boyfriend or a legal partnership. A living loss can be your children leaving home. A living loss is also, funny enough, when you gain. So, when you commit to a relationship, you gain the relationship, but you give up your freedom. Having a baby, I did a case study of 2 babies being born in the book, actually. You gain the relationship with the baby, which, as you said, gives you enormous joy and sort of breaks you open with love. But you give up a lot of your life. You give up your freedom, you give up your work capacity, you give up your sleep. It changes your relationship. So, I mean, loss is absolutely intertwined in every aspect of our lives. And I think it's not been fully acknowledged. And I think, if I look at the 30 years of clients that I've had through my door, if I look underneath the presenting issue, the thing that connects them all is that they have a problematic relationship with change. And I think particularly in the 21st century, where we feel that we have so much control because of our smartphones and kind of technology, people feel that somehow they must be doing change wrong because they feel chaotic, they feel loss. And living loss, you have exactly the same feelings and emotions as grief, that you feel lost, you feel sad, you feel angry, you feel confused, you feel despair, you feel numb. And people don't kind of recognize that that is normal. So they feel that they're doing it wrong and everyone else is kind of sorted.
Mm. And I think that as a society, we are used to kind of pushing it down again. Certainly you hear people talking about losses that they've experienced. They go, "Oh, but I'm very lucky." And whilst it's great, I'm sure absolutely great to count your blessings and to look for the positivity, often I feel that's a way of not really acknowledging the true grief or loss that someone is actually experiencing. And that's sort of very, very much a sort of societal thing.
I think there's a sense. I mean, it's so complicated, this, because I think there's a sense that if you're really suffering, that can be a sense of that you're failing, that somehow that's shameful. That if you're kind of living your best life, being your best self, you just get on and succeed, and you thrive through all the difficulty and you surf the waves, and that there is truth in that. But also, I think we really need to acknowledge that we need to allow ourselves to express and feel the pain of it. I think what I also think, though, is that we need to do that with the closest people around us. We don't necessarily have to post it on social media or Instagram or whatever it is, because it's very exposing. So I think where we have intimacy and trust and we feel really known, those are the people that we really show what we're feeling and what we're having difficulty with. And then I think to put on a kind of stiff upper lip when you're out in the world, when you're at your job or kind of shopping, it's quite good to be able to move between the two.
Yeah. So Can we talk a little bit about anger and grief? You say in your book that the anger that you feel in grief is very different from the anger that you feel sort of day to day. How so? Yeah, sorry.
I could see something was happening. Anger. I define anger and grief as an expression of hurt, like, oh, I'm hurting, and it needs to be expressed. And, you know, we were talking this morning that there is a kind of collective rage that needs to be expressed. And it's there to force us to face it. It's there to help us. It's an energy anger. It's an energy to change. It's a force to kind of move forward with. Fear is the anticipation of pain, like, oh, you're going to hurt me. But I think how you find a way of expressing your anger matters, in that I think we hold it in our bodies, and so we need to find a way of expressing it. Often exercise or sport is a really good way of doing it. But then we need to follow it with something that soothes us. Or you can vent. I mean, I get people to hit their bed with towels, or to punch a pillow, or if they're swimming, to kick in the swimming pool, maybe write furiously, paint furiously, dance furiously, hit a ball furiously, and then do something like even just a 5-minute meditation where they breathe in for 7 and out for 11, and then do something completely different. And that would be watch something that's funny or listen to something that's funny. So you have a kind of cycle that you go through, because you can't be angry and be amused at the same time. It comes from a different part of the brain. So the worry with just venting anger is that it can get you into a cycle of staying furious rather than it being something that's cathartic and releasing. So you need to kind of follow a route that supports you through it and allows you to express it.
That's so interesting. And we're just about to go to questions from audiences, but I wanted to talk to you, just to ask you one last question. I know that so much of your work has been with bereaved children, and that must be one of the most difficult things, is how do we broach the subject of death with children? What do we tell them? How do we support them? When should we be worried? And I was wondering if you could tell me about what you've learnt about that in your years of working in that field.
What I've learned is that very naturally parents of children want to protect them from death. They don't want them to suffer. They want them to be happy and to be innocent. And, you know, there was the Department of Education wanted, for instance, to put in a programme around death in schools, but the parents were very much against it because they thought it was, their children shouldn't be made to worry about that. And that really is much more coming from them. What we know from all the research is that children, if someone dies in their family, and it can be a pet, it can be their grandparent, it can be their parent, it can be a sibling, children need exactly the same truth as the adults around them. That it needs to be spoken to them, it needs to be communicated in language that they understand for the age that they are, and not to use metaphors. So, children lose things every day. Heaven can be the cafe up the road, so that we need to use the word dead, that your grandfather very sadly died this morning. That means that he's dead. His body doesn't work anymore. He doesn't breathe anymore. And if you touch him, he's cold. So that they have a full understanding, the same as yours, and that over a period of time, they understand why he died. And they may, certainly at St Mary's where I worked, when siblings and babies died, I encouraged families to bring the siblings in to see the child, see the baby, because what children imagine is much more frightening than the truth. So, for instance, I had a young boy who didn't see his sister that died, and he was told that her body was in a coffin. He then started bedwetting, and he'd imagined that she'd been decapitated, that she had no head. So, children could be very literal. But also, when we hide the full story from them, with the good intention of protecting them, they tend to pick it up. They half hear stories, they know something's going on, they see their mum or their dad crying, they pick up things. And now with social media, their friends at school will know. So if they're going to trust their parents, they need to know the story from them first, and that they can keep going on and asking questions. And also we need to allow children to grieve. So, the sort of often the things that people say about children is that they're amazing, they bounce back, they're extraordinary, and children are extraordinary. But we need to let them be sad and to be happy kids. And one of the metaphors for bereaved children is to let them, hop in a puddle, be very sad, be comforted, not told not to cry, but be comforted until they stop crying. And then they hop out of the puddle and they eat an ice cream, kick a ball, paint a picture, bash their brother, and get on and be a normal kid. And that's how they, over time, adapt to the loss.
Yeah, that must be one of the most sort of damaging and common phrases that we hear. Don't cry, yes. And we tell each other. I found myself saying it to my baby the other day, and I was like, no, I don't want to say that to him. I want him to cry when he needs to cry. Yeah, it's one of the most healthy ways, of course, that we can actually release and express that sadness. So we've got a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to go to those now.
Please, that's nice.
So we have one. How do you cope with the lowest moments in grief when you simply think that you can't cope?
I think you need to kind of acknowledge it. There's the paradox of grieving is that when you allow yourself to feel as low as you do, and I'm sorry you've had those very low moments, that you kind of acknowledge them, maybe think to yourself, what is it that I'm feeling? What is feeling so low? What do you feel in your body? What are the words that are coming in your head? What are you voicing? Maybe you can journal. And over time, as you allow yourself to feel the lowness and you don't fight it and you don't block it, that allows other feelings to emerge. I do think we need connection to others. So if you're not alone, when you're feeling very low, find someone who you can talk to, or someone who can hold you, someone can create a playlist with you that you can just sit beside and listen to a piece of music that mirrors what you're feeling. Often art and music and culture can connect us to what we don't find words for ourselves. And go for a walk. Rituals really help when you're feeling very low. Mm-hmm. You can create your own ritual around the person, whether it's lighting a candle or putting flowers in front of a picture, remembering them, talking to them, writing them letters, postcards. I think all of those things are important to do when you feel low. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yeah. Thank you.
I hope so, whoever asked.
So the next question is, I've lost 3 relatives in 4 months and I can only grieve for one due to the overwhelming nature of my feelings. How do I deal with this?
You're right. I'm so sorry. That is so much loss. And, 3 big losses, 3 deaths of people significant to you is overwhelming for your system. I think it's true. We can only grieve kind of one person at a time. And I don't know if there's one person that is more significant to you than the other. That's probably the person that you're grieving now. And I think the big thing is to give yourself compassion, because you may feel guilty if you can't grieve the loss of the other 2 people. But be kind of kind to yourself and compassionate to yourself, and give yourself the understanding that you would a friend, that it's just not psychologically, physiologically possible to grieve 3 people at once, and that's to support yourself to grieve one person, and then over time it may be that you'll be able to grieve the others. But I would get support. For that big a loss, if I was you, I would get support from a bereavement organisation or a therapist, because that's a lot to manage on your own.
Mm-hmm. So what can you do to help yourself once the funeral is over?
That's a big question. I think often there's a big adrenaline rush right up to the funeral because you're so busy. There's all the organisation, everyone's in and out of your house. And, you know, with clients with me, often they contact me sort of 2 to 3 months after the person has died, when people have gone back to their lives and you're left on your own. So I devised something called the 8 Pillars of Strength that you could have a look at. It's on my website, where you kind of create attitudes and structure and beliefs that help support you, given that you feel probably very fragmented or very kind of tipped to one side. And some of it is your attitude to yourself, that you're self-compassionate. Some of it is the relationship with the person that died, that you find touchstones to their memory. Some of it is, I always tell people to take exercise, that grief feels like fear in your body. Moving your body, being outside really helps calm you, because you go into fight or flight when you're grieving. Grief often feels like fear. So to do physical exercise, whether it's walking, whether it's running, whether it's going on your bike, whether it's any kind of sport, just get outside and move your body. Kind of recognize that your relationship with time is altered. You have a longing to look back, and you want to kind of, it's difficult to look at the future, but sort of recognize that. And recognize that you have limits. You couldn't, your concentration, your capacity isn't as strong as it was, because so much of you is preoccupied with the person that's died. One of the things I often do with clients is create a sort of structure. So I encourage people to go back to work. I think it helps having work. I think it's a shame everyone's working from home, but I had to have a sort of mini structure of a time in the day when you exercise, a time in the day where you have connection with the person that died, time when you get chores done or do your work, and time when you connect with other people. And those things, and choose to do things that actively soothe you, whether that's cooking or watching telly or listening to music or doing your garden. Actively choosing them, knowing that they soothe you, I think is very helpful.
And I guess, well, I mean, you said it, but kind of allowing yourself to be where you're at, rather than sort of judging it and thinking you shouldn't be where you are, basically, which
Yes,
I think
again, that's a big part.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of habitual, certainly for me it has been, you know, habitual kind of thought pattern, and it's probably very unhelpful.
I call that the shitty committee. Often there's this kind of critical voice in your head that's telling you, you're so stupid, you're not doing this right, get on. Like, be aware of your shitty committee, write down what it's saying, look at it and see that you would never speak to a friend like that, and dial it down. You can even imagine dialing it down on a radio or a television, and be as kind to yourself as you would a friend.
Sounds easy, but that's
it's hard to do.
It's the lifelong work, isn't it?
Yeah.
So how do you grieve for someone who's alive but is lost to you?
I think, I mean, it is more complicated. I don't know if it's more complicated because there isn't a hierarchy in these things. I think the first thing is to turn off all social media with that person. That you can do this terrible thing of sort of tracking them and following them and kind of being addicted and hooked on the happiness that they have and you no longer have with them and you don't know. So I think you have to kind of make a decision and draw a line that, you know, I'm not going to look where they are. I'm not going to try and find out about them, and maybe do some kind of ritual that is a significant ending for you of your relationship. I mean, it sounds a bit like watching Friends or something, that you would kind of burn something, you know, outside of everything that represents them. But I think you could be creative and create a ritual that works for you, that sort of marks an ending of that relationship. And then I think give yourself permission to feel the anger, the sadness, the loss, because it's a friendship or a love that you wanted that you no longer have. And that does really feel like grief. Again, make sure you're connecting with other people and that you kind of choose to do things that support you. And don't beat yourself up because you think I think when it's a living loss like that, people can diminish it in their mind because they sort of think, well, it's not as bad as death. But actually, I don't think there is a worse or better. I think it is whatever it is to you. So allow for that.
Yeah, heartbreak can certainly be full of grief. Yeah, it's the worst. So there's another question here from one of our audience members. How can you help people who are resistant to help? For example, let's say a teenager who's suffered significant loss but doesn't want to engage with support.
I think teenagers get most support from their peers, often from support organisations. They have groups for young people and they go online and they get most support from them. So I would encourage a young person to find that for themselves. I think what's important as a family is to you can't force it on them. And also asking a young person what they're feeling is like asking them to do open heart surgery. They're never going to tell you. And it feels like pressure. So I think just name that you understand that they don't feel able to or ready to talk to you, and you respect and value that. But maybe look creatively at ways that they can find support for themselves. I think as families, walking and talking or walking and not talking is a way of staying connected. And then at the end of it, doing something that feels like a treat. In pre-COVID times, it would be going to have a pizza or going to have a pub lunch. Now it might be going home to have your lunch. Because when you're walking and talking, you're not eyeballing each other. And the adults around a young person and a child model how to grieve. So if you're expressing what you feel and you're showing that you can both feel very sad and that you can function and get on with your life, it gives the people around you permission that they can do that too. So they learn most by what you're doing. Mm-hmm. So if you're very much feeling like I mustn't show them, I mustn't upset them, they will be reflecting that back to you. And there's often in families co-protection where the parent isn't showing the child the pain, the child isn't showing the parent the pain, and then there's a gap of understanding and a gap of connection. So I wouldn't have a kind of breakdown over your child, but show that your child that you're sad. Mm-hmm. Say what you feel, be tearful with them if you're someone that cries. Mm-hmm. And that might help them reciprocate.
Mm-hmm. I was reading actually in another book the idea of saying to a teenager, "Oh, I'm here to talk." It's baffling to a teenager. What's there to talk about? But as you said before, just being time together is just as valuable as any sort of deep chats or how you might think it has to be.
And keeping family meals, I think even if it's only once a week, having places where you sit down together. Often young people talk to you in the car when you're not eyeballing them again. So create opportunities without asking them how they feel, opportunities for them to express how they feel. The other thing I often do with families is give them suggest they get a jar or a tin. And if it's a family member that everybody knew, to now and again, or other people that visit you in the days that people visited you, you pop a memory in the jar or the tin, and then once a month or every 6 weeks, you sit around the table and each of you read the memory from the jar. And that's a lovely way, or you can have a book that people write it in. That's a lovely way that isn't pressure, that's very simple, of remembering the person that's died together.
Thank you. And so related to that last question, actually, how can I help someone who's in the throes of raw grief and says she doesn't want to see or speak to others because they remind her of her old life and lost loved ones? So someone who's shutting themselves off socially, I guess.
Yeah. I think you need to hold both. So I would reflect back, I absolutely respect that you don't want to see me and people around you, and I understand that. But also hold and say that I am here, that I want to be part of your life in this new life that you don't want and you didn't choose. And so I would suggest something. So maybe every few weeks I'm going to pop by and bring you some soup. If you want to sit down and eat it with me, that's great. If not, I'll just pop it off, so that you're actually proactive. You're not being too pushy, but you're kind of being robust in your belief that this relationship to this person as they are now, not the person before they were bereaved, really matters to you, and that you're prepared to kind of fight for that relationship, to stand for it, to show up for it, and to weather the storm of it. And I think over time they will really value that and see in you aspects of themselves that they're not seeing at the moment, that maybe they can too.
So practicing lots of patience with that
Lots
person.
of patience. But it's trust. It's fundamentally, it's trust, that I trust in our relationship and I trust in you, that as difficult as this is and as low as you feel now, I trust that we can get through the storm and we can still have a relationship.
So this is perhaps quite a big question. I know we don't have a huge amount of time. Yeah. Well, they're all big questions, aren't they? Yeah. What are your thoughts on GPs prescribing antidepressants to help people who are grieving?
I mean, I hold both, really. You know, grief is, I think, a natural process. And for most people, they don't need medication. I mean, they may need sleeping pills to begin with if it's a very traumatic death. I think if someone has a pre-existing psychological condition, the grief may disturb them, and so they may need sort of more higher dose and a different prescription. For some people, it creates an internal rupture and a fault line that was sort of waiting to happen, and they are completely unable to cope. They don't have the resources within themselves to manage the level of the pain, the level of the fragmentation, the kind of madness that they feel. And for them, I think medication is necessary. And that enables them to manage the level of the pain enough that they can then get proactive and find the support to have a therapist, to see a psychiatrist, to have other connections that enable them to manage.
And so we have just, I think, time just for one last question, and they are all big questions, so it feels wrong to say just quickly. Someone's just asked, after 10 years of repressed grief or of repressing grief, it feels too painful to open up. At this point, what could be a safe first step for them?
I think you've done it. You've named that you've had to repress grief for 10 years, and you're beginning to allow yourself to have the idea that you've got a first step. So I think you've done the first step, and I really kind of respect you for that and acknowledge that for yourself. I think I don't know you, so I don't know what your habits are or what feels familiar. But what I would sort of suggest to you, if I was your therapist, is look at your existing coping mechanisms, that they are not to talk, to shut down maybe. And I would do something that puts you one tiny step out of that comfort zone. So it may be just with yourself, writing to the person that died. It may be having a short conversation with a friend about the person that died. It may be going online and looking for support that you can get. So just take it, don't have a huge leap. Do within the frame of how you normally cope, a small step that takes you, that's a bearable step that takes you a little bit out of it. But you have made the first step, and I really respect and value that you've done that.
Yeah.
Maybe read other people's books, their memoirs or experiences of grief, and you'll see that what you feel is normal. That might be good. Or there's quite a lot on telly of stories of loss. to maybe do those rather than avoid them. Maybe put together a playlist of happy and sad songs that remind you of the person, that kind of puts you in touch with your feelings, and then let the feelings come through your body.
Yes, I'd say sort of attending the Good Grief Festival is a good first step. There's lots of resources that we have online. Yeah, and
that's a very good point.
And we do have a bookshop actually where we have your books for sale, Julia, and other people who are speaking. And lots of resources. So please do have a look at that. For everyone who's watching and for everyone who's asked questions. We're not going to have time for all of them, but I do think we've got time for one more. Can
I just say that people who haven't had their questions answered, if you've got other questions, do contact me through my Instagram page, Julia Samuel MBE, and I'll answer your questions through that. To keep the conversation going. I wish we had time, and I really appreciate the honesty and the courage to ask such difficult questions. I really feel a lot of respect for all of you.
And I would also say that you have a podcast as well that I listened to in preparation for this interview, and I found it so very moving, these interviews. I think, I would absolutely recommend that to people if they maybe find it hard to pick up a book. Of course, we have audiobooks as well, but perhaps a podcast.
Both my books are
I'm a big fan of a podcast.
Voice,
yeah.
It's short.
Yeah.
Little bite-sized chunks. Yeah.
Yeah. So how long might one expect to find themselves grieving before it becomes defined as complicated grief? So I guess they're asking what a normal time to grieve is, if there is such a thing.
So to some extent there isn't such a thing, and of course there is such a thing. So 7 to 10% of people who grieve is complex grief. Many of those already have psychological diagnosis before they're grieving, so they have a predisposition to have complex grief. I think if you looked at the DSM-4, the psychological manual for the definition of complex grief, is that if at 6 months, the thing about grieving is you still have feelings. So you feel sad, you feel angry, you feel out of control, but you have feelings. And those feelings are what are enabling you to adapt to the loss. I think one of the kind of definitions after 6 months of complex grief is that you feel just low. You feel incredibly depressed. You may feel on the edge of suicidal. You have no energy. You have no kind of vitality. I think that would be a time where you would go to your GP and seek help, or come to Cruise or many of the other organisations that could support you.
I have one more question. I keep saying it's one more question, but let's get another one in. I just read, so this person says, I just read that Kim Kardashian was gifted a hologram of her dead father for her birthday. I had some reactions. How do you feel about the use of technology in grief?
Oh, I'd like to know what your reactions are. I think it can be really helpful and also slightly bonkers. I sort of feel both. I think having, when I talk about touchstones to memory, having a hologram of your dad might be a really wonderful thing that you can go to and look at. And, we always talk to the people that have died, that you can talk to that hologram. I think what's unhelpful is when we kind of don't filter what we're feeling and protect ourselves enough, and we put it online for other people to have responses to, and they can be very critical. And that, I think, is potentially kind of damaging, because you feel so vulnerable already that putting yourself out there to be criticized by other people can be a high risk business.
Mm-hmm. We've got 1 minute, so I'm going to try and squeeze one more question in. As a therapist, do you ever struggle with your own emotions if a client is expressing something very upsetting or traumatic? If so, how how do you overcome this?
So yes, I mean, through both my books, I show that I cry with my clients, and I sometimes have nightmares from really terrible, terrible stories. My perception of danger in life has certainly been changed because, 20 hours a week, I hear quite devastating stories. So the things I do are lots of physical things. So I kickbox, so I cycle, I walk, I go into nature, I watch funny telly. I would never watch frightening telly, not for anything in the world. So I kind of try and put back the opposite of what I experience. So I kind of try and balance myself out. I have supervision, I have therapy, I journal, I kind of do the stuff, and still sometimes I really feel ghastly because I'm a human being, and sometimes it feels too much. That's it.
And that actually does bring us up to time. We don't have time for any more questions, although I have so many we could ask you. People watching at home, please do send us your thoughts via Twitter. We're at Good Grief Fest. We're also on Instagram. And please do go to the bookshop and buy Julia's books. They're absolutely beautiful and incredible. And thank you so much, Julia, for joining us today. A marathon session at Good Grief Festival. Thank you so much for all your insights and wisdom. And thank you.
Thank you, Millie. Lovely questions. And thank you, everyone that's listening, and for the courage to come and listen and come to the festival and explore with us and other people the things that you need. So I hope you get what you need from coming here, and that this will be a first step, or maybe it's 100th step or 1,000th step in ways of finding support for yourself, given that you're grieving or you're supporting someone that's grieving. And stay in touch. Thanks, Millie.
Thank you.